Hello everyone, this is Ricardo Land, head engineer of Rakoon Sound Studios, and I want to welcome you guys to another episode of our Tips and Tricks show, where we share information about our equipment and how we use it to make music. This episode is going to be a bit of a special because we're not going to be making any sound or reviewing any gear in particular. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how to get started with a hardware production setup, which is something that I get asked from a lot of the people that come here to the studio. So in this video, I'm pretty much going to be talking about my recommendations for what can be your first synth or your first drum machine, and also the things that you should be prepared for when you are planning to get a hardware setup. So without further ado, let's get right into the talk. Okay, so starting your first hardware setup, or how to get started with hardware music production. As a lot of you may know, producing music with hardware has been getting back in trend once again. In the past few years, there's been really an explosion of releases of new synthesizers, drum machines, samplers, sequencers, effects, a lot of things, and it's a little crazy. And especially if you're new to this and you want to know how to get started with this, it might be a little overwhelming for you to make a choice on what to get. So I think we should consider a few factors into what goes with it as far as making your decisions. Number one, it's gonna be the budget, what budget you're working with. There are very affordable synths, drum machine, sampler, etc. And there are ones that are in the more expensive side of things. Number two is space. How much space do you have to in your room or in your studio to fill it up with machines? Number three, I would say, is how much time are you willing to spend with the gear to learn it, because there are machines that are quite intuitive and they're easy to pick up. Their workflow, it's super easy, and then there are other pieces of gear that require you to spend more time with them because their learning curve is quite steeper. Then we should also consider what type of a producer are you? Are you a musician, or are you more like a sequencing kind of guy? You like to program stuff on the step sequencer. And then the last thing that we should consider is what kind of a recording equipment do you have? Do you have an interface? Are you planning to record this into the computer? Are you planning to record your music into a tape machine? So that's very important. Something that people don't consider when they're starting to get gear is that you are going to need the inputs to record the gear. So with that being said, let's start talking a little bit about drum machines and what are my personal recommendations on your first drum machine. To be honest with you, when people ask me, I want to get a drum machine, what do you think is the best drum machine for me to get as a first one? I always say, with my eyes closed, Roland TR8. And I'm not talking about the TR8S, which is also a great option, but I'm talking about the original TR8. I think that's a great first drum machine for a few reasons. First of all, it's not so expensive. It's not the cheapest drum machine, but it's pretty affordable. Number two, it has a really intuitive workflow. So if you've never used a drum machine before, the TR8, it's super easy to learn. Number three, it is very useful because it comes with a pack of sounds that you're gonna be able to fit in most dance productions. It comes with 909 sounds, 808 sounds, 707, 606, 727. So those are all classic sounds that are gonna be very useful, really easy to work with. So for me, hands down, the first choice that comes to my mind is the Roland TR8. Now you also in that sort of price range, you have things like the Arturia drum root, which is a great drum machine. It's has a great workflow, great sound, but I don't think it is as flexible when it comes to sound as a TR8 is. The drum root has kind of like a unique sound to it, and it will only fit certain styles of music, whereas the TR8 can kind of fit it in most things, especially because it has 808, 909, 707, 606, etc. So a TR8 will fit in most productions, whereas the drum root, you know, it's a bit more limited, you know. Then you can go cheaper than that, and that would be a Korg Volca Beats, which I don't think it's the greatest drum machine out there, but you know, it's fun to use, you know, and it can be a good place to start if you've never used drum machines before. It's only $150 or $160, so not a bad option. The other thing that I like about the TR8 is that you can record audio through USB. So if you don't have a giant interface, you know, like you can still multi-track, meaning you can still record the separate instruments of the drum machine, so you can process them later. So TR8 is great. So on the cheaper side, I would say like a Volca Beats, or even like the Teenage Engineering Pocket Operators. They have a few drum machines there. You know, they sound great, you know, but they don't, you know, like you're not gonna be able to do as much as you are gonna be able to do with a TR8. Now, if you want to get on the more expensive side of things, you have things like the Electrons, you know, like the Digitact, which isn't really, like, I wouldn't say it's a drum machine. It's more like a groove box, because you're not limited to drum sounds. You can load up any sample that you want. But it does have, like, it's an Electron piece of equipment, and the Electron gear is amazing. It's some of my favorite, but it does have a steeper learning curve. So if you're new to things, you might get a little frustrated with it at the beginning until you learn it. And then you also have things like the Analog Rhythm from Electron, which is, again, it's pricier. It's an amazing drum machine. You can get so deep within the sound design of it. But it's a little more expensive, and the learning curve is going to be steeper, so you're going to have to spend more time with it. And then I don't want to forget to mention the TR8S, which I made a comparison between the TR8 and the TR8S prior to this, and then you can find out in detail what is the difference between both. But I would say, you know, the TR8S is great. It's amazing, pretty easy to use, but it does have a little bit of extra depth compared to the TR8, the original TR8. It's a little pricier, and it has a little bit of extra depth, so maybe a slightly steeper learning curve than the original TR8. But it's also a great drum machine. If you have the budget, I wouldn't say it's a bad place to start. Now, obviously you have the boutique models for the TR09, like this one here, from Roland, or the TR08, which are pretty good too, but in my opinion, the TR8 will give you more for the money, because you have all sounds of the boutiques, plus it's easier to record, it's bigger, and I think it's by far a better option. So I would say the TR8 is my opinion for a drum machine. Now, we talk about synthesizers. There's a few things that we should consider with synthesizers. Number one, I would say, is, do you want a monophonic synth, or do you want a polyphonic synth? Meaning a synth that can only play like one voice, or like so you would only be able to do bass lines, leads, effects, drum sounds maybe? Or are you looking for something that will do kind of like pads and chords and harmonies? So I would say, I mean, when people ask me what is the best synth for me to get if I don't have any synths, I always recommend the Korg Mini Log. I think that's a great synth to get started with. We used to have one in the studio, we don't have it anymore because we have other synths here, but I think it's a great synth. It just has like a really easy to use interface. It sounds great. It has a built-in sequencer. It's not expensive. It's just a great synth from Korg, the Mini Log. Then another option would be, I would say, the SH01A from Roland. I love the SH101 and on the SH01A, which is the boutique version. I also made a comparison between both. You get extra voices, so you get 4 voices of polyphony. You also have a few additional effects over the SH101, and you can't beat an SH101 interface. It's just so quick and so easy to use that for me it's also out there in my list of recommendations for a first synth. It's also not so expensive, so I would say the SH01A is great. And now Roland just came out with a new revision of the Juno. I think it's called the JU06A, which I think it looks amazing. I think I'm gonna plan to get one of those in the studio just because I'm just such a Juno freak. So I would say those are pretty good. Obviously, if you're more of a keyboard player, you might want to get something bigger. If maybe something like the Behringer DeepMind, which is kind of like a Juno emulation, I would say. If you want to go for something more pricey, then you can look at the Sequential Prophet 6 or the OB6 from Sequential as well, or any of the Dave Smith or Sequential instruments. And now you can also go for a Moog, like a Sub 37, like the one that we have here, but it's a little more expensive, quite more expensive. Like Moogs like that, they run for like over $1,000, and it is monophonic, so that means that you won't be able to do chords or pads or stuff like that with it. It's a great synth, but as a first synth I always recommend people to get something that does polyphony as well. Now you also have things like the 303, emulations like the Avalon or the TB03, the boutique model, but that is only gonna give you like bassline sounds or acid sounds. So I would say it's a great piece, but you should know that it has its limitations when it comes to sound. Now a really great one, I think it's the Electron Digitone, which it's kind of more pricey than most small synths, but I think it's great. 8 voices, FM synthesis, a really comprehensive way to present FM synthesis. I think it's really amazing, but it does have a steeper learning curve than say the Mini Log or an SH01A, so be prepared to spend more money and spend more time with it. Then you also have things like the Analog Keys, which again from Electron has a great sequencer, but it is more pricey and it will require you to spend more time with it. So that's my take on synths. I would say as a first option, either like the Korg Mini Log or the SH01A are great. Now let's talk a little bit about samplers and I would say groove boxes, because there are 2 types of samplers. I would say there are samplers that use that you can use loops and chop up loops, and then there are samplers that are one-shot samplers, sort of saying like the Digitact here, and those allow you to load samples into them, but you won't be able to time stretch or to chop up loops. So when it comes to like one-shot samplers, you have stuff like the Korg Volca sample, which we don't have it here in the studio, but we've had people bring it in, and I've tried it, and it's amazing. I think it's great, especially for the price and for the size that it has. So that's a good option for like a one-shot kind of like groove box. Then obviously there's the Digitact, which is a little more pricey. It's an Electron product, so it is a very deep machine. You can do a lot with it. It has a lot of potential, but you're gonna have to spend more time with it to learn it properly. Then you have stuff like the Novation Circuit, which I think it's, wow, we have one in the studio. The Novation Circuit is a great groove box, and it's not so expensive either. I think it's under $200, so that's a good option as a groove box or like a one-shot sampler. And then if we talk about samplers, well, most samplers are kind of pricey. I don't think I can recall of a sampler that's under $500. So for those, I think the best options are obviously the Octatrack, something like an MPC, the MPC Live especially. I'm a big fan of, and we're planning to get one in the studio by the end of the year. That machine is amazing, especially it does absolutely everything. It also has kind of like a steeper workflow. The MPCs, they're not the easiest to use, I would say. They're not the most intuitive, but the MPC Live just looks amazing. I've tried it, I have some colleagues that use it, and it's just ridiculous. Then the Octatrack is also from Electron. It's also great piece of gear, it's so crazy. You can use it in so many ways, but it is not by far the easiest machine to use. You're gonna have to spend a lot of time with it to be able to use it properly. It's also quite expensive. Well, now the Mark 1, which is the one that you're seeing here, has gone down in price considerably now that the Mark 2 came out. So you can pick up one of these, I guess, used for like $700 or $600 maybe even. It isn't the easiest machine to use, but it's totally recommended if you're willing to spend the time with it. And then I also want to mention the Teenage Engineering OP1, which I did a review of it a few weeks ago, and that one is an amazing synth sampler, drum machine. It just does a little bit of everything. I think that's one to consider as a sampler. It's a great sampler. You can chop up loops. You can record the radio. You can record yourself. It's portable, battery powered. It's amazing, but it is a little expensive. Really fun to use, really quirky, kind of like gives you results that no other machines can. It has like some great onboard sequencers, some really funky ones. So it's definitely one to consider, even though it's a little pricier. So I would say that's when it comes to samplers and groove boxes, if you will. Now let's talk a little bit about sequencers. Well, a lot of this gear, it's gonna come with built-in sequencers, and a lot of them are great, but sometimes you might want to control all your gear from one piece of gear, one sequencer. So there are quite a few options on that. There's a few sequencers like the Pyramid sequencer. Here in the studio I used Ableton as a sequencer, and for the synths that don't have a sequencer built in, I use the Push to send notes to it, which I think it's amazing. Then obviously, the Electron, these Electrons, they're not only, like, for example, the Digitact and the Digitone, they're not only samplers or synthesizers, they're also MIDI sequencers. So the Digitact, it has 8 tracks of MIDI, so you can connect up to 8 machines and control it all from Digitacts, which is a great option. So I would say that's as far as it goes in sequencers. And I forgot, I should also mention in the part of samplers, the Pioneer Torais SP16. I think it's a great option too. It's also kind of expensive, and it's quite big, but it is also a great option as a sampler. Now, going back to sequencers, I should also say that you should consider, when you're getting synths and external gear, consider getting a MIDI interface. Even though like most of the synthesizers coming out today, they have like MIDI over USB, I still think it's useful to have like a MIDI interface, like the iConnect MIDI 2 or iConnect MIDI 4, and those will allow you to send MIDI through regular MIDI cables. And I just prefer MIDI cables for some reason. I prefer to use MIDI cables rather than using USB over MIDI. So I would say also consider getting a MIDI interface if you're planning to get some gear, and that will allow you to send sync and MIDI information like notes, and also MIDI CC, so you can control parameters of the machines via your DAW or via another machine. So that's also one thing that you should consider. And then I want to talk about the interface, because that's, like I said before, it's a very important part to consider when you're starting to use hardware gear. It's what recording equipment are you using for it. So you should know, especially for a drum machine, if you're planning to multi-track it, so to send the individual instruments into your interface, well, you're gonna need a lot of inputs. Unless you're using something like the TR8, which is great. You can send the audio through USB, so you can multi-track all the individual instruments of the drum machine through USB. But if you are planning to use another drum machine that doesn't do that, well, you're gonna need a lot of inputs. Or if you're planning to use a lot of machines simultaneously and record like a live jam, you're gonna need a lot of inputs. So I would say at least like an interface with 8 channels of inputs is great to have. Here in the studio we have the Apollo 8 combined with the Apollo 16 linked. They give us here 24 channels of inputs that are received from the 24 channel disc that we have here, the SSL XL disc. So definitely consider what interface you're getting. I always recommend, if you're serious about this, I recommend the Apollo, the Universal Audio Apollo interfaces. They're great, especially for the fact that you record without any latency, which is also an issue that you're going to be dealing with if you're recording hardware, is dealing with the latency and getting it right. Well, with the Apollo interfaces, you don't have to deal with latency. Here we have we obviously have the Apollo 16 and the Apollo 8, but we also have this Apollo Twin, which is great. I think it's an amazing interface. It only has 2 inputs, but you can combine it with something like the Audient AS800 preamp. Audient AS800 preamp. That combined with the Apollo Twin is great. We have one here, and that has pretty much is a preamp with 8 inputs, and it has like an ADAT out, so you can send 8 channels of audio via ADAT into your Apollo Twin, which has an ADAT input. So that effectively makes the Apollo Twin a 10 channel, 10 input interface. Something to consider right there. And I recommend the Apollos for the fact of the latency. It's just such a relief. You know, latency can be such a headache sometimes, and there's always ways to deal with it and to get it right. But just to not think about it, I think it's great. So yeah, I mean, that's as far as my recommendations for getting started with drum machines, samplers, and sequencers and synthesizers. Uh, well, now I want to talk about a little bit about an extra thing, which is vintage gear, and what are the pros and the cons of it. We have two pieces of vintage gear here. We have the SH-101 and the Roland Juno 106, which we love them here. We use them all the time. So what are the pros of vintage gear? I would say the pros of vintage gear is their character. Vintage gear has, because of its age and because of the original analog components, it's gonna have like a lot of character. So I would say that's the pro of it. The cons is that it is expensive and you're probably gonna have to service it occasionally, and servicing vintage gear, it's not cheap, definitely. So, you know, I honestly, I always recommend like current, like new gear that's coming out instead of vintage gear, unless you're like a purist or something and you want to go for the real thing. You're gonna spend a lot of money. You are gonna get that character, you know, but you're gonna spend a lot of money and you're probably gonna have to service it. And also, vintage gear doesn't have the syncing options that you get with every gear today. You know, for example, the SH-101 doesn't have a MIDI in, you know, so you have to, the way I send MIDI to that is through the ARP Odyssey that has gate and CV outs. So I send MIDI through the ARP Odyssey, and then I connect the CV out, gate and CV outs to the gate and CV ins of the SH-101, and that's how we send MIDI to it. If not, we have to sequence it with the external clock in, which I love doing that, but sometimes you want to just send like normal MIDI notes to it, and a lot of vintage gear doesn't have MIDI, like regular MIDI capability. So that's my take on vintage gear. I love it and everything, but it has a few perks. So yeah, I would say that would cover this video, and I hope that this can serve as a guidance for you when you decide to get your first pieces of gear and your first synth, drum machine, sampler. I hope you can get one soon. They're really fun to use. I think it's a great way to make music. It's so intuitive. It's so rewarding. It's so fun to use. But you have to be prepared for it. So we hope you enjoyed this episode of our Tips and Tricks show. If you have any comments, please leave them down below. If you have any questions, leave them down below. Also, if you like the video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for future content. And finally, I want to mention, if you are in the Miami area and you need help with music production, audio recording, DJing, etc., we're here to help. I'm leaving our information down below so that you can reach out to us and ask us for our rates and services. So again, this is Ricardo Lund, and I'll see you guys next time.